we are going to go ahead and get started. Thank you all for being here to learn how states can tackle food waste and hunger at the same time. My name is Danielle Melgar. I am the Food and Agriculture Advocate with the Public Interest Research Group. We are a national, nonpartisan advocacy organization calling for common sense solutions to problems that impact Americans' health, safety, and well-being. And I'm also proud to be co-hosting today's webinar with our partners at Environment America. So we're going to begin today with a brief overview of the interconnected problems of food waste and hunger in the US. And then I will pass the mic to our speakers who will share about solutions that you all can implement in your cities and states. Then we will open the floor to Q&A. To submit your questions, you can use the Q&A function along the bottom of your Zoom window. Feel free to go ahead and submit questions as you think of them. We will just compile them at the end and get through as many as we can. Also, before we begin, I want to make sure everyone is aware that today's session is being recorded so that we can share it out with registrants who are not able to attend. But after recording the main session, we will stop the recording before we begin the Q&A to just allow for more candid conversation. And then one last thing before we dive in, I see that we have several representatives from California on the call, and I just want to give your state a shout out for the recent good work. For those who don't know, last year, the state's mandatory organic waste collection law went into effect, diverting waste from landfills all across the state. And in December, Los Angeles passed a good local zero waste policy that requires leftover food from city facilities and events be donated and that food scraps be composted. So really great to see that leadership. Love to see more of that across the country. Okay, so what is the problem with food waste? The U.S. Department of Agriculture estimates that as much as 40% of our food is lost or wasted across the country each year. When that food goes to waste, all of the resources that went into producing it, from fossil fuel-based agricultural chemicals, land, fresh water, and labor, to all of the fuel that's used to transport it from field to fork, is wasted, creating unnecessary environmental pollution. And when that wasted food breaks down in landfills, it releases methane, a potent greenhouse gas that is significantly more warming than carbon dioxide. So it's no wonder that Project Drawdown, a climate solutions think tank, lists tackling food waste as the second most impactful solution to tackling climate change. They calculate that food waste reductions could achieve the emission savings equivalent of taking 200 million gasoline-powered passenger vehicles off the road for a year. All of that food waste also translates to billions of pounds of nutritious food, more than enough to feed the 34 million Americans that face food insecurity each year. So committing to addressing food waste in your city or state is therefore also an opportunity to address a key social issue. In an age where our farmers have clearly demonstrated that they can produce more than enough food to go around, no American should have to go without. And for all of us concerned about the cost of living right now, food waste reduction can translate into serious cost savings for consumers. The most recent estimates find that the average four-person household purchases $1,500 worth of groceries that go uneaten each year, and those estimates don't account for recent food price inflation. But fortunately, opportunities to tackle these problems are already here, as you'll hear about today. While new technology for harvesting, storing, and tracking food can certainly help reduce food waste and ensure that hungry people are fed, some of the most effective opportunities are achievable with today's technology and just require a push from public policy to put those solutions to work. So the policy decisions that are made at the state and local level will drive a lot of this change. because there are so many diverse communities across the country that really need to take into consideration their own unique circumstances, and come up with individualized plans that will help effectively educate the public and build dynamic, resilient food systems. What I hope all of you take away from today's session is that this problem is solvable, and each of you has the power to contribute to the solution in your own communities and states. So today we will hear from Dr. Brian Rowe, a researcher who has studied the impact of public education on food waste reduction in Ohio. Then we'll hear from Natasha Duarte, the director of an organization in Vermont that helped spearhead and implement the state's universal recycling law to ensure we stop sending food waste to landfills. Then we will open up the floor for questions. So without further ado, Dr. Rowe, I will turn it over to you.
Great, thanks. All right, organize my screen here. And away we go. Well, thank you for that introduction, and thank you for framing these issues. Today, I want to share with you some of the research I've been involved with. I've focused as a university professor and as an applied economist over the past 5 years on the topic of food waste. In fact, I've joined efforts with about 15 other universities around the country through an NSF-funded initiative where we have an entire research network focused on sustainable, resilient, and equitable food systems and how we can achieve those by addressing the issue of wasted food. Today, what I'll share with you is some results from a more local effort in the metropolitan area of Columbus, Ohio, where Ohio State University, my employer, is located. It's the Save More Than Food campaign. This was developed by the Solid Waste Authority of Central Ohio, SWACO is their acronym. And after they had done some analyses of their own landfill waste, they realized that this would be an area where they could really try to improve the efficiency and the environmental sustainability of their efforts. And so by partnering with organizations throughout Central Ohio, they developed a waste action plan, a food waste action plan. And that led through a consultation with some professional partners, the general public, the Save More Than Food campaign, which really focuses on food waste, why it's important to people, how to provide actions to reduce it, and really emphasizing what you said earlier, which was that wasted food is basically wasted resources. Then I was part of that process as part of that big group, but then SWACO reached out to myself and to the city of Upper Arlington, one of the inner suburbs of Columbus. And SWACO reached out and worked with EPA Region 5 to get some funding to be able to test a specific campaign that was released to Upper Arlington. And so we'll report here is some of those efforts. And the general evaluation approach is we would take that big suite of items from the Save More Than Food campaign, worked with Upper Arlington to deliver those elements to people inside of Upper Arlington, and then try to do what's known as a difference in differences evaluation. That is, we would try to assess desired outcomes, so amount of wasted food, attitudes, behaviors, composting efforts of those who were treated as part of the campaign, got campaign materials before and after that campaign, and then contrast those to that of a control group. And so by being able to do that, we could isolate the effect of the campaign on people's behaviors and attitudes and other outcomes. And as we know, the control group is always important because there might be some type of seasonal or secular trend going on, and you could either under or overestimate the true effect of the campaign. If, for example, like in this instance, suppose there were a downward trend and you accidentally decided to say that the entire reduction was due to the campaign when really part of that was just a regular seasonal downward trend. In our group, we looked at a couple possible control groups. We did split up Upper Arlington into 3 different groups, and one received lesser materials than the other 2. We also went out to the nation and did a national survey of households online, and they did some of the very similar types of measurement by survey, as did our folks in Upper Arlington. Some of the treatment areas in Upper Arlington, one area got stuff focused on food storage, and how that can help you reduce food waste. Another one got really intensive materials and even some freebies with respect to composting materials. And then the control group got general information only about the overall campaign. Kind of the big take-home message of all this was that indeed the campaign did appear to make a difference on several fronts. The first picture here is self-reported food waste, and this is items that were once edible on a grams per person per week basis. And if we look at those bars, what we see there on the left is our campaign area, Upper Arlington. In the spring versus the summer, we see a downward trend, but a 23% reduction in self-reported food waste among those responding to the survey. At the same time, we went out to national audiences and gave basically the same survey to people from throughout the country. And there we saw an uptick of about 29% in self-reported food waste, again, using the very same survey instrument as was given to Upper Arlington. So a kind of very difference in trends, and about a 52% difference in those differences in terms of self-reported waste. Now, we know self-reports can sometimes be optimistic, and so we also were able to work within Upper Arlington only to assess the amount of waste that ended up in their curbside waste stream. And so there we saw a 21% reduction overall in both food scraps plus the once edible food that was wasted and ended up going to landfill among those households participating in Upper Arlington in this event. When we broke that out into 2 different groups, the one that got the very intensive composting intervention, we saw that effect was even larger, about a 42% reduction. Specifically, a lot more edible items tended to be, a lot fewer edible items tended to be wasted during the summer period after the campaign was implemented. And all those summer numbers are coming from about 9 to 13 weeks after the campaign was implemented. So kind of a short-term assessment. We also looked at awareness of that campaign. There had been a general county or region-wide rollout of the campaign. And so in the spring, there was about 6.5% of people who were somewhat aware of the campaign. But after the campaign, and by the time we surveyed in the summer, over 40% were aware of the campaign. So definitely was a spike in awareness of the campaign itself. And many of them also saw it as an effective campaign in terms of whether they thought it would create actions to reduce food waste as well. Among those modes of campaign delivery, the community newsletter, which was very popular in Upper Arlington, seemed to be receiving a lot of attention, as were mailed and emailed materials. The other part we looked at was Upper Arlington has a compost drop-off program. And so you can see numbers here from 2019, 2020, and then when the campaign began in the spring of 2021, we definitely see a big uptick in participation of composting. And these are numbers from the entire municipality, not just people who were involved and responded to requests to do surveys or requests to have their waste audited. So this is a broader scale measurement. And the survey did reveal that people did have an increase in composting activity, and lots of people said that they were composting either for the first time ever or for the first time in a long time. So we did see a bounce in terms of compost drop-off. When people were pressed about maybe some barriers they might perceive about composting or what might encourage them to compost more, we had a fair number of people who said that there were no current barriers, but some did identify lack of equipment and supplies, fewer lack of knowledge or time. In terms of what could encourage composting more, curbside services were seen as a very interesting avenue to encourage more composting, as were free containers for collection. So, kind of in conclusion, what we've learned from the campaign is that it did yield some statistically significant changes, and I think meaningfully sized changes in terms of the amount of reported food that was wasted as we measured it by the survey. And we found very similar amounts of reported observed reductions in waste in terms of what was going to landfill in terms of their waste audits, both slightly over 20%. We did also see an uptick in residential contributions to their drop-off composting program, and definitely an increase in residents' awareness of that specific campaign. And so if we consider Upper Arlington as a treated group altogether, and we use that national survey as a control group, these results are even more marked because the national trends seem to be going from a lower to a higher from spring to summer during the year of 2021, whereas Upper Arlington was going the other direction. Interestingly, we found very few or no significant impacts on residents' attitudes as measured by the survey, kind of key knowledge indicators, and even some kind of antecedent practices you might expect from food waste reduction, like meal planning, proper storage of food, or shopping with a list. Some of our recommendations from this process were to keep supporting community level implementation of similar campaigns. It did seem to have a noticeable and meaningful impact. We found that deploying the campaign through trusted community actors, in this case, the municipality of Upper Arlington, did seem to be a trusted community actor, and they had community newsletters and communications vehicles that people seemed to use. The other thing was we recommended that communities be cognizant of specific traits when they're deploying kind of food waste reduction and diversion efforts. For example, in Upper Arlington, prior to any of this, they increased the frequency of their compost pickups at those drop-off locations. They were finding that they would be filled up after 3 or 4 days, and then people would become discouraged. And so they increased the frequency of pickups to encourage people to compost more. But that all predated the implementation of the campaign. And we have some other recommendations for policymakers and practitioners, and even for researchers who might be interested in this. I will point you to the full report of this that's available. Here's a link to a very long paper with all the gory details of the measurement, the implementation, all the materials, all the surveys that we used. There's a more condensed version of this that is just available, I think, yesterday or the day before in the journal called Waste Management, that came out through a peer-reviewed process. And some of the material was also highlighted in a New York Times article that came out on the first of the year of this year as well. All right, so I think I will pause there and see if there are any immediate questions, or otherwise I can hand it off to whoever you tell me to, Danielle.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. And if you send me those links, I can include those in a follow-up email to all attendees for anyone who's curious.
I could drop them in the chat if that's helpful.
Okay, yeah, that would be perfect. Well, thank you so much for sharing that background. I think it's really helpful to see the impact that public education can have, even over just a short period, to really drive down food waste, which is, of course, the most important measure that we're looking at there. So now we will hear from Natasha Duarte on the universal recycling law in Vermont.
All right, thank you. Just get my screen shared here. Oops. All right. Well, thank you for the opportunity to share Vermont's story. I'm going to start with my video on, but if my internet signal gets weak, I may just turn my video off as I'm speaking. I'm the director of the Composting Association of Vermont and also the chair of the Vermont Farm to Plate Network Food Cycle Coalition. And today I'm going to be talking a bit about Vermont's Universal Recycling Law, or Act 148. I'm just going to give an overview of it because there's a whole lot that we could get into, but there'll be plenty of time for Q&A as we move forward. So the Universal Recycling Law was passed unanimously in 2012 and effectively bans blue bin recyclables, leaf and yard debris, clean wood, and food scraps from the landfill, with the goal of improving the capture and diversion rates of these materials. The food scrap portion of the law, which is what we're focusing on today, was rolled out between 2014 and 2020, starting with the largest generators within 20 miles of a compost facility that could take the food waste, and culminating in a full ban down to the residential level, regardless of distance from a facility. It's important to note that this law was passed without funding attached to it, and it was intended, the law itself was intended to send a clear signal that both private and public sectors, private and public sectors, that these materials would be available. And we hope this would provide incentive for investments in infrastructure to meet the anticipated demand. This is the food recovery hierarchy. It's very similar to EPA's, except we put composting and anaerobic digestion on the same level. And this is actually embedded within the state's law. There's a lot of, since 2012, we've done a lot of education and outreach for all of the different layers. And relevant to today's discussion is the inclusion of language around source separation in the law as well, which effectively means that separation of compostable materials from non-compostable materials or packaging needs to happen at the point of generation for the lower three tiers. So for getting the food waste or food to animals, composting, anaerobic digestion, and energy recovery. The most recent data we have about how Vermont is doing is from 2018. An estimated 20% of what's being landfilled is still food and food scraps, and this is around 77,000 tons per year. And about half of this is residential. We're really looking forward to the next waste composition study, which is going to be happening this year. So we should be having new data for to share out soon. But there are some highlights that I did want to touch on. So first, food donation into the charitable food system has nearly tripled since 2014. So once the food ban portion went into effect for those largest generators. And I have to say that this was not necessarily an anticipated result of a solid waste law. So while feeding people, not landfills, is definitely, high up there in that hierarchy, the magnitude was more than what the charitable food system was ready for. And I'm not going to be getting into the details today, but I do want to just let folks know that there's been a lot of need for and a lot of building out of infrastructure to support this outcome of the law as well. A 2018 study found that 40% of residential food waste was being either composted or fed to animals in 2017. And this was a 9% increase from the 2014 data. There's actually just a study done by UVM that was released this month that indicates that Vermont residents have reported increasing the proportion of food that they separate from their trash from 48% before the ban, before July 2020, which is when it went into effect for residents, to 71% after the ban. Another highlight is that the number of organic haulers that support diversion has almost quadrupled since the law went into effect, driven primarily by that July 2020 date. So between June and November of that year, the number of haulers jumped from 24 to 30. And that subset of those haulers that provide services for residents, so curbside services, things like that, everything from 5-gallon bucket pickups to small totes, jumped from 16 to 27. And so this is a really significant piece of Vermont's story in terms of how we're getting this done across the state. We don't have time to get into details of all the different funding programs, but I wanted to share an overview of some of how implementation of this law has been supported. We've been able to leverage PA funds and grants. State has provided hundreds of thousands of dollars in infrastructure grants for municipal and solid waste management districts. In addition to these larger funding opportunities, we've had school compost grants, home compost bin grants, so addressing the issue of accessibility to the kitchen caddies as well as home compost systems, as well as outreach and education grants, just to name a few. Additionally, several programs have received support from our Agency of Natural Resources that support the law, including the Vermont Organics Recycling Summit, an annual education and outreach event, the Master Composter course through UVM Extension, which I think really helps build that people infrastructure piece that supports the law and sort of changing the culture around how we think about food waste and what we do with the food that's no longer edible. And then they also provide technical assistance for composters, including an annual compost operator training, which is like $40. So super accessible and easy to anyone who's really interested in learning better how to compost. In terms of challenges, there have been a number of iterations for the hauler requirement, which was part of the Universal Recycling Law. Driven primarily by concerns about residential pickup and route density for haulers, especially in those rural areas. And what we've landed on and how the law currently reads is that haulers are required to offer food scrap collection to commercial customers, but for residents, they only need to offer the service to apartments or condo units of 4 or more. And if another hauler is providing service in an area, then they're off the hook. So basically, as long as someone has a geographic area covered, not every hauler who services that area have to offer those residential services. Bag drop haulers, which are essentially mobile solid waste collection operations, are all required to offer food scrap collection because they're essentially drop-off sites. And I'll also just add here that we do have over 100 transfer stations around this, permanent transfer stations around the state where people bring their trash recycling, and they all now accept food scraps as well. Another challenge that we've been facing and finding different ways to address is cross-agency or cross-department coordination. This being essentially a solid waste law, jurisdiction has been primarily with our Agency of Natural Resources, Department of Environmental Conservation. But we've recently been working on getting the Agency of Agriculture more involved and working to support and incentivize farmers to get involved in food scrap composting, which is one way to fill some of those infrastructure gaps in rural areas. Compost markets have also been slower to develop than we originally had predicted. This gets at the idea that we're not just diverting organics from the landfill for the sake of diversion, but that there's actually a lot of value in using the compost generated from increasing diversion rates. So we're keeping this all out of the landfill, we're turning it into this great compost. And then in some cases, it was really just sitting there. And it was really hard to move at a larger scale. I will say that the pandemic has shifted compost sales across our state, but increasing them significantly. Many composters are at least through last year, we don't know about this year yet, but we're selling out pretty early in the season. But I think there's still a lot of opportunity and work to be done to increase municipal procurement of compost and get compost and compost-based products into road and stormwater projects. And the last thing I'll touch on today are policies around the management of packaged foods. The use of depackagers effectively outsources the separation requirement in the law. And what we found is that we sort of jumped into this technology being available, and it confused messaging around maintaining the integrity of clean streams of organics for uses at those higher levels of the hierarchy. And so we've been recently going through a stakeholder process and that wrapped up at the end of this past year and is leading to new policies, and ultimately we'll be going through a rulemaking process to look more in depth at how we manage food packaging or packaged food. So looking at this just a little bit more closely from that 2018 waste composition study, we know that about 30% and 38% of the food wasted, of the food waste that was landfilled was packaged. So that's just shy of 30,000 tons a year. In 2019, towards the end of 2019 is when we saw some of the larger generators like grocery stores and some institutions actually trucking their organic waste to a depackaging facility that's combined with anaerobic digestion in Maine. In 2020, our first depackaging facility opened in Vermont, but that's what led to between 2019 and 2020 is when we were realizing that things weren't going exactly as the law intended. So a lot of never packaged organics were being commingled with plastics and aluminum and other packaging material. So sort of downgrading that whole stream. And currently, as of this past legislative session last year, there's a moratorium on new facilities. And that's really just sort of hitting the pause button so we can be a bit more thoughtful about how we can keep this 30,000 tons or so out of the landfill, but still really adhere to the best and highest uses outlined in our law. And there's a whole lot more that could be said, but I think I'm going to end there. My contact information is here. I'll give a highlight that the upcoming Vermont Organics Recycling Summit is the first week of this coming May. And this is where we really get into a lot of these issues in much more detail. So if anyone is interested in joining, you can learn more at our website on that as well. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Natasha. Really helpful to have that case study and layout for other offices considering doing something like this, what challenges they can expect and what the impacts might be. So that concludes our main session, and we are now going to turn it over to our Q&A. So I will pause the recording.